Hi everyone, I'm Jack. I'm the chair for the grand final. With me and Anna, Aunt, Bibi and Rob. And the teams are debating that schools should prioritise teaching indigenous languages as a second language over popular global languages. On team Affirmative, we have A and U2. Woo! And that's Emily, Felix and Ali. And then on negative, we have USU2. Woo! And that's Ollie, Catherine and Angus. Clearly 2 must be a lucky number. Good luck everyone.
In the speech, firstly a little bit of setup, then on why it's better for indigenous languages, and then why it's better for education. Firstly, on a little bit of setup. Firstly, what do we think prioritization looks like? I think obviously we try to implement indigenous languages where we can in education systems, but because it's prioritized promotion in places where it's extremely difficult, we won't try to pursue it. I think that's also to say that schools do have a capacity to implement other proximal languages. For example, like Gadigal is kind of a difficult language to teach, but like Wiradjuri is kind of similar and in a similar region and is easy to implement. We would prioritize that in that circumstance. Secondly, what do we think languages actually taught look like? I think firstly in the Australian context, it just looks like learning languages of the local indigenous group in which the schools reside in. I think then in other countries where revitalisation is like a strong movement, for example in Ireland where they're trying to revitalise Irish, in Welsh in Wales and Maori, it just looks like putting those indigenous languages in there. And lastly, in countries with like strong indigenous languages, but where their curriculums are taught in English, we'd particularly put this system in for them to learn their indigenous language. That looks like Papua New Guinea, that looks like Vanuatu, with Bisha and Philippines with Tagalog. Okay, firstly, why is it better for these languages? I think a little bit of framing here, and that's to note firstly, just to point that our impact for all of this is particularly good for vulnerable languages that are dying out in the status quo. And I think that's just to say that as languages become like more and more vulnerable, they just become harder to revitalize, and that's because the number of people who are like able to speak this language just decrease. And that just means that when schools are teaching it, it's going to be the most successful version of revitalization because you just get a lot of people involved in the language. Why do we just get better outcomes for these languages then? I think firstly, it's just because we get large government investment. Even though the topic says it is about schools, I think government just has an incentive to invest in it because they need to have a consistent curriculum over across the schools. They need to have an implementation of like standardization, things like that. What do we think this actually looks like? It looks like developing things like textbooks, which is really important because the way in which these languages are being revitalized in the status quo are ways in which linguists are able to understand, but not for like the average individual to be able to understand and like learn from. Secondly then, it looks like the a development of like vocals, I think that says. Okay, for the reason of dying out. So the reason that, vocab, the reason for these things dying out is just because they don't have the vocab to currently like engage in like newer sort of language. For example, I don't know, like some of the newer languages that are coming out. And that just means that when it's taught in schools, schools necessarily have to engage in developing new vocab to be able to like, be able to teach this in a context where children are able to, okay. Thirdly, I think it's not just the government who are invested in this, but particularly schools who want to be able to teach this to a very well extent because they want to be able to like educate their students. That looks like even in governments who aren't being super involved, private schools would probably develop like a lot of funding towards this thing. But then lastly, I think like when you're like establishing this, you probably want to give the students who are learning this some usefulness, and that means that governments have an incentive to put some of the language that they're learning on in science, because they think that like, you know, they want students to see the benefit in, they want people to buy into this program, and that just means that this is particularly important for revitalization because we just see a proliferation of this language in general. I think the benefit for this then is firstly, it's just good for individuals who are trying to learn the language because it makes the language learning process just more accessible in a way that it wasn't previously. But secondly, I think that there's a huge benefit for native speakers because it means that they also get accessible accessible things that they're able to teach not only themselves but also to their children with, and then you just get like more people engaged in the language. Secondly then, I think that it's beneficial for cultural knowledge. I think firstly it's important to note that a lot of cultural language is inherent in the language. For example, a lot of kinship terms in indigenous languages in Australia are like like ingrained in the culture and ingrained in the language that they speak. And that means that when kids learn about these languages, they necessarily gain an understanding of how that culture works in the first place. Secondly then, it's because you have to necessarily learn language through culture. That looks like when you're learning First Nation languages, teaching them through Dreamtime stories, which is a way to make them accessible and fun and interesting for children. But that also means that they're able to learn necessarily the culture behind it. But lastly, often, even though states may try to involve themselves in the revitalization process in the status quo, note how it's like particularly inconsistent on their side, because instead of they might just devote one sort of project towards language learning versus our side where we have consistency in people learning it over and over again. Lastly then, I think there's a huge benefit because teachers just will care on our side. I think that's because the first thing is that probably these teachers are going to be, native speakers of this language, whether that be like elders of the tribe. That just means that they're inherent and in the community and they probably have a really good understanding of that community. But even if they're not, they're learned in this language, which means they've dedicated a lot of time into learning this language and learning the culture and the necessary aspects around this culture. That means that they're going to be very passionate and able to engage children in a very good way and able to teach the culture in a very good way. I think the impact of this then is twofold. Firstly, you just get more cultural knowledge, which just means that you get more understanding of the cultures around you. But secondly, it's better for the native speakers who now have the ability to engage in the community around them. For example, if you're in a community who speaks Creole, when people who majority speak English start to understand your language, you are able to engage in your community in a much more meaningful way. That also looks like things like engaging in your government in a more meaningful way. That was a particularly good thing. Secondly then, why is this better for education? Firstly, I want to do a little bit of framing on the purpose of high school language learning. I think it's just easy to say that, obviously this is not to teach you to speak, because the proportion of people who probably get fluency out of these languages is going to be low, but it's also because you can't get the necessary immersion that you need to be able to get fluency. And so that means that the reason that people actually engage in high school language learning is probably because it's good for problem solving, because it gives you a cultural understanding about the world around you. But also, if you want to do the language learning of other languages, you probably can, right? There is some capacity to do that, which means that people just aren't losing out on the benefits that they try to tell you about global languages. And I think that's just to say that there are just many alternatives in the status quo to be able to learn languages outside of a school capacity. That looks like textbooks that are relatively available for many different languages. They're probably free online. Secondly, a lot of media is available on the language, whether that be watching K-dramas or things like that to immerse yourself in the culture. Those are relatively easy to access. But lastly, because of the internet, you are just able to see this language online. Note how none of this exists for indigenous languages, which is why we are able to uniquely claim the benefits on language learning. I think that just means that you just can't that negative can't get any of the benefits of learning languages in school that they would try to tell you, because for them to win, they would have to prove that all kids to some capacity are able to learn this language to a really good extent, whereas what we are trying to prove is not that people learn the language necessarily, but that we get benefits for example, indigenous people, or that people just learn the culture around the language much more. So why do we get that? Firstly, I think it's just because it's easy to say that indigenous languages are just more engaging for individuals, because that is the language of the place that you live. For example, if you're learning Irish in Ireland, you probably are more engaged in your learning than if you're learning some random language, because these are words that you hear on a daily basis, because these are words that are in your community. That also means that you have a greater ability to be able to practice these words in your native language, and that just leads to more engagement in the learning process. But secondly, I think it just helps literacy to a greater extent. And this is particularly important on the framing that we give you at setup, which is cultures who teach in a third language, for example, English, but that's not their indigenous language. I think when people are native speakers of indigenous language, they are oftentimes a little bit isolated from the language, from the education process in the status quo. That looks like, when it's taught in English, but your native language is Tagalog. I think it's really important that we teach these indigenous languages in there, because firstly, it just makes these students more comfortable, but secondly, they learn better because people now have more access to their language, they're more easily able to be understood, but thirdly, they just have teachers who can help them more because they have teachers who engage in this language. I think that was a particularly good thing for these individuals because they were more able to engage in the education system. So proud to propose.
So sorry, I just realized we're not doing bells or claps or anything. Okay, we can, if you have the bells, that'd be awesome. Wonderful. I thank First Affirmative for that speech, and I welcome First Negative to continue the debate.
It's kind of high, it's embarrassing.
It's not that fragile, but
I'll be fine.
People hate learning Latin, and that is a language that is in the same script as English. That is a language that is invented by white people, and that is a language that is more familiar to these students. But overwhelmingly, students just do hate learning Latin because it's unuseful, and they cannot see what the point is in them like learning it. The only way to teach second languages when your brain has developed after the age of 5 is to learn them in a structured and school environment, which we explain on side Affirmative is squandered on languages that they themselves explain that they're already exposed to in their everyday life, or dead languages that they would never buy into and is completely unuseful. First thing on setup is just to explain where this debate takes place. We think this debate occurs in post-colonial states because otherwise the native language is just the default language that they would learn in. And we would explain that in our comparative, they would just make it an elective. We would say that second languages mean that the school teaches in that new colonial language. I think that's relevant. So first argument then, why indigenous languages survive anyway and why they're worse on side Affirmative. We explain that indigenous languages are just popularly spoken, and that's by their own admission. These are languages that are spoken at religious events. Those are languages that are spoken between family members and in your extended communities. We explain that in a set of post-colonial states, people are just extraordinarily multilingual. They already pass down that language, and that's just because parents and grandparents and families have an incentive to preserve those cultures already. We would explain that they already have maximum incentives to preserve their own languages. That is not. It's unclear that what the additional benefit that they provide on side Affirmative. We explain then, when the federal government teaches this language, because obviously they need to preserve continuity about how this language is taught, it is done fairly badly. They're likely to do things like disrespect the language, but sanitize that language and, not teach the culture behind that language. But we'd also just observe that in a lot of these states, the minority language or those native languages are languages spoken by rebel groups who have fought against those governments. So obviously those governments have an incentive to sanitize those languages to a huge degree. But we'd also just explain that they're unlikely to do things like host cultural events or do those deeper insights just because they require a lot more effort. And we'd explain, they require a lot more effort and their growing pains of the revolution or whatever. We explain that these are the best parts of the culture. It's unclear why you're likely to preserve them in school, but additionally it's unclear why you need to host these events in school and why those communities can't hold them already. We explain that they have the maximum incentive to host them already. It's unclear what hosting them in school additionally serves to preserve these languages. And this is really important because in these contexts, a lot of these people do speak those indigenous languages already, even if it's not the national language. It's unclear why you need to teach them formally. And note again, this is Affirmative's best case, because in the cases where these languages are dead, that is extraordinarily problematic. Because if these languages are dead, they actually just get zero buy-in, and it's they get absolutely zero buy-in. And note again, given their frame of the government would spend a lot of money on this, they'd do lots of investment, and they would do this in in order to revitalize languages, that necessarily means that these languages necessarily have to be compulsory to some extent, because if they're not compulsory, people don't understand what they're useful for, and therefore you aren't able to make it revitalize. Governments can't see return on their investments. So if governments are able to show that, hey, we spent a lot of money in investing into these new languages and revitalizing them, obviously they have to make them compulsory to some degree. But whereas on the comparative, we'd explain that global languages are comparatively far more opt-in. Why is this forcing these indigenous languages, especially if they're dead, incredibly problematic? We explain that these kids just do not buy in and they do not listen. One, when these kids are forced to do something, they just inherently do not like it because their agency is restricted. Kids do not like having their agency restricted. They're likely to not listen irrespective of what the content is. But secondly, they just don't think it's useful. We would say in these contexts, when the language is dead, these kids absolutely do not buy in. But in contexts where those languages are thriving and those indigenous people are still in those lands and speaking those languages, it's unclear what they additionally do to preserve those languages that those people don't already have those incentives in the first place. So that's why they don't benefit those languages at all. We would explain that even if you force it down those kids' throats, you're unlikely to change their minds or get them to do anything differently. Second argument then about why global languages are far better taught on our side and why they're more important. We would explain that you must teach these languages through formal education, because their claim is you can watch a bunch of Japanese anime and then think you speak Japanese. Obviously not. We explain that you must have formal education in order to teach these languages properly. And that's for one, my psychology degree tells me that kids functionally have a mechanism in their brain that stops them from learning languages once they've hit 5, but additionally once you hit 18, that's completely impossible. But we would just explain that the extent to which, the earlier those languages the later those languages are introduced to you, that means you're less likely to be able to learn them as quickly, which means that when as I explained before, those native languages are already exposed to those kids, to their family and friends, things like Tagalog and those things, those kids are already amiable to those languages, which means they're able to learn them outside of those structured environments. Whereas if they're living if they're in Australia and they want to learn Chinese, they're likely never going to have learned Chinese before or heard it before, but by the time they reach school, which means it's especially critical for those languages specifically that they're taught in a structured context, because they're less sensitive because they haven't heard them as much comparatively to indigenous languages. But secondly, we'd explain that English and other global languages are extraordinarily difficult, and that's for the simple fact that in order for those languages to be utile for you in order to use them as careers and use them to go to different universities and stuff, universities have language tests, jobs have language tests to test the minimum standards of language that you have, which means that the amount that you need to be proficient in those languages for indigenous languages, the bar is far lower, whereas the bar in order to be competent in English enough to go to Sydney University, if you're from a different country, those standards are far higher, which further tells you that the need to teach these languages in a structured environment just is far greater. But secondly, even if you believe that you have access to media and those sort of things, we'd explain that that media is extraordinarily casual. If you listen to Rap God and you're from not an English-speaking country, that is just a language that is not going to be accepted in the ILT when you try to study at Sydney University. Obviously not. And we would explain that the nuances of grammar are extremely difficult. Those are things that people famously cannot understand, which means it's super insufficient for these people to read a book or watch a movie. Obviously, those people have extraordinarily, the language is just casual and would not be useful in an external context because they have extraordinarily high standards. But next, we would explain that individual feedback is extraordinarily expensive. So individuals learn best when they receive feedback on how they're doing. We explain that that feedback is extraordinarily difficult to access. That feedback is hard to access. Finally, we explain that this needs to happen in a school because without that discipline, then kids have no incentive to learn that. Without giving them homework, they have no incentive to download and process that information every single day. We explain that this learning second languages must occur in a school context. But additionally, it's exclusively in school where teachers and other pastoral care and staff can leverage narratives of jobs and employment and the usefulness of these languages to these kids. So even if you believe that, again, these kids could learn them outside, it's very hard for them, they might only have one source of that information, that might be their parents. We explain that you have other avenues and more legitimate avenues of information of teachers with years and years of experience that can explain to you why learning that language is particularly useful. So, on their comparative then, these kids are already exposed to those indigenous languages. So to the extent in which you need to have them in that structured environment is obviously not that much. Whereas for these second international languages, these kids would have no exposure to those languages by the time they hit school. That's why these languages exclusively need that structured environment. That's why it's wasted on their side. Why are these languages taught well then, comparatively on our side? We explain that the government wants to support them because if you send people away and they repatriate and send money back to their home country, that's good for your government. But we explain that kids are comparatively far more likely to buy in, but it's additionally easier to host these programs because you actually have stuff to work on and then feed those textbooks that they say in those structured environments with teachers that can give you feedback. That is extraordinarily important. Look, this is all at their best case, right? Because if these languages are dying, these kids don't buy in, these courses are even harder to make. But secondly, we explain that you're more likely to listen and buy into these languages when they're in a school, but you all prefer a system where these kids need to learn these languages in a structured environment. We provide that on side negative, so vote side negative.
Wonderful. I thank first negative for that speech, and I welcome second affirmative to continue the debate.
At the start of the speech, I want to point out their misattribution of context, because they completely misalign the examples that we give you of where this exists in the status quo. They tell you the way you grew up around learning a certain language, obviously you didn't need to learn the language in school, and also obviously it was passed down between generations and indigenous peoples had incentives to pass those down. We explain revitalizing language is important where those languages are on the verge of dying, as they often are in the case of the status quo, where you have deficiencies of vocab, where you have few native speakers, and where those native speakers are incredibly few and far between, because they're dispersed across large sections like the Northern Territory, where it is very resource intensive to do linguistics projects where you examine and go between all of these, and where you don't have the incentives to attribute funds to them, because it's not like they're going to be massively used in the way that they would in schools. Obviously, it doesn't apply to the cases that they talk about. Passing down languages between indigenous people, I guess, maybe makes sense, but in the cases that they talk about, which is where these are, oh, they would know these at home anyway, obviously we just explained that, firstly, it allows people that don't speak this language and aren't from this community to communicate far better with them, which just creates better cultural connection and resonance. And secondly, we obviously explain that in these areas, it just does help a set of students that are from these languages themselves, which is, you are more familiar with your native language, you don't need to learn it in school, you need it to be taught in school, so you can ask the teacher questions in your native language so that they can explain the content better to you, because you didn't understand it in the English that it was taught to you originally. Obviously, this allows far more agency for the students within that system to have a better learning experience. They totally misattribute the issues that we point to with the different contexts in which they claim that indigenous people are still able to do those things. I'm going to deal with three things in the speech, or kind of two actually. I just saw this third piece of paper and I assumed. Firstly, I'm going to talk about learning global languages to sufficiency, and I'm going to push back on their points about buyout. And secondly, I'm going to talk about their very insufficient responses to why indigenous peoples are massively benefited by this. Firstly, on learning global language to sufficiency. 3 reasons why people aren't likely to do so. The first one is because it is seen as the first stages of learning a language in itself. And I think the intuition prompt that I would point to this is just that most university courses pick up on what exists on the status quo. The highest levels of high school learned language are like intermediate level university course understandings. And when you bake that into the curriculum, certain school curriculums are aware that people are going to continue the language if they enjoy it in the future. So there's no point in investing it massively under the status quo. Where there is future options to do so, they're less incentivized to invest. But also we explain that there is just other resources out there, which I'll deal in the buyout point below. But secondly, just note that they often probably don't have native speakers that teach these languages in a lot of cases, because it is, I guess, just like in a lot of areas, it's hard to necessarily find the resources to find a French or Spanish teacher. And when you have a billion textbooks out there, you can probably entrust that to someone that can teach from a textbook, even if they're not actually teaching it to a sufficient scale and to a sufficient amount of understanding. But thirdly, note that eventually people just leave these languages after they leave school, obviously, and we explain that they're not at sufficiency at the point where they opt out of these languages. This is simply because they are given control to opt out of things that they aren't forced to do, because they never explain why languages would be opted or wouldn't be compulsory under their side, even though they try and use it as a mech to discount people engaging under our side. Obviously, where they're still compulsory, people get to university and maybe doing the language doesn't fit in their degree, or they just didn't enjoy it as much because it was hard and they were forced to do it, and they resented that choice itself. So people are just likely to opt out into it and not continue it to the sufficiency that they actually require to get any utility benefits in this debate. Obviously, we note here that we don't need to prove that we reach a level of sufficiency, because firstly, we give you a massively independent path to victory through research, which is just to say that there are languages which are dying. There are people that are losing their ability to communicate about their culture in a language they were born into, which colonization eradicated from them, by often in large cases killing large amounts of the populations, from preventing these languages from being learned, and by enacting and going back against that. Obviously, that is correcting a massive principled wrong which was done to those people. But also note we explain that cultural connection and empathy is much better, because you can communicate with people from that community better, and also because we explain that there is a cultural understanding baked into it, where you have more awareness of the indigenous traditions and indigenous perspectives. You're just much more likely to act politically in particularly beneficial ways. It means you understand more when indigenous people, for example, protest the destruction of sacred sites or art, for preservation reasons, even though it's a massively economically beneficial thing to do so, or there might be mining in that area. Obviously, when you understand the significance of traditions and understand people's connections to the land, you're likely to act politically in particularly beneficial ways. Why do people not buy out under their side? They say people do buy out because they don't pay attention. Firstly, obviously kids don't view individual utility in the same way that they do, because you're like 9, you're not thinking, well, China's a pretty big global hegemon, I'm going to want to be able to communicate in Chinese in the future. This is a silly understanding. Maybe they could explain the parents do that, but they did not do that at first. Secondly, note that obviously they also make this compulsory, as I noted, which means that if it's about being forced to do a language, obviously they would buy out equally where they're being forced to do Spanish or French than if they're being forced to do an indigenous language. But thirdly, we explain you can learn these languages outside. They say this isn't possible over the age of 18 for vague psychological reasons. 3 responses to this. First of all, people learn from immersion all the time. This is factually untrue. When people immerse themselves in a language of other language speakers, you just are able to learn language at a far higher rate. Even if it's slower than you would if you are a child, learning a language over a period of years and then immersing yourself in that culture still gives you a pathway to do so. But secondly, they explain why individuals are the most incentivized to do so, even where it's difficult for them to, because they say it's good for their business or it's useful for people in life. And obviously, if you see utility in it, even if you're 19 and you might not learn it as quickly, you obviously see that having a working understanding of Chinese or Japanese is going to be massively useful to your business endeavors. So you're likely to work hard at it, you're likely to stay at it, and you don't need to learn it in school in the same way. But thirdly, we explain that there just are structured courses for these languages in the first place, which is just to say, obviously because of those usefulness reasons that they explain, there is structured courses where you do have to do things like submit homework or have classes every week for Spanish or for French, because there are massive speaking populations of them, because there are entire regions of the world that speak them. And that does not exist as a profit incentive when you're teaching indigenous languages that have far smaller populations and far less utile applications. Clearly after this, we think that people don't massively buy out. They do learn and they do accumulate some of the benefits that we give you, but also note they never learn their languages to the sufficiency that they would require to claim any of the utile benefits that they want, because they need working understanding. We just need the investment of resources, and we need the cultural understanding which you can get at much younger ages. Okay, let's talk about why this is better for indigenous peoples. Their responses to this work in incredibly specific contexts. They say some governments in like post-conflict states or whatever are going to sanitize languages, or they might disrespect these cultures. Maybe they're languages that are like from rebel groups potentially. Firstly, note this applies in a relatively small section of the world, and obviously our case can apply in a number of different contexts as we explained, because it's in large contexts where you have some revitalization of a language, which is large countries like New Zealand or Ireland, but it's also in places where you just have a vast majority language like English, and you have a dispersion of different indigenous native languages in the way that we would in Australia. But the second thing to note here is just it is very hard for the government to do this kind of disrespecting that they suggest, because obviously when you're talking about minority languages or languages from indigenous groups, the sources that you get it from to do things like construct vocabulary and like learn culture and construct lesson plans and curriculums are just more likely to be culturally sensitive because they're from the elders themselves. Those are the few remaining native speakers of these languages, so obviously they're likely to try and ensure that it's done in particularly sensitive ways and bake in things like cultural traditions where the government might otherwise not be very good at doing them. So we think that there is no capacity question under this case. Lastly, they say that indigenous people do just pass down languages, but I think we do just respond to this, because in our worst case, this is still incredibly useful because people can learn significantly better by doing things like asking questions in class, and just because we explained a number of different contexts. Because we explained to you that, for example, with the language of Creole in the Northern Territory, obviously where there are a lot of monolingual speakers of a certain language, having a working understanding of that language just does help your connection and interactions with those communities, because it means you can understand each other a little bit better. It means you can negotiate more. You can understand where you're doing things that are culturally insensitive to them and correct yourself, even if you didn't have bad intentions in the first place. But also note, we explain why there's likely to be a large amount of investment in cultural knowledge, because it's things like kinship words linking specifically to familial bonds and arrangements of family structures, which is just the history and culture of these people. It's things like cultural stories being the most continued usage, because we've learned the most about things in indigenous Australian languages from like the Dreamtime, for example, and cultural stories. They are just the cases where you can see the most utile applications in teaching of this language. And lastly, because they explain the government would invest in it to get value by doing things like putting signage in different languages. For these reasons, so proud to have done.
Wonderful. I thank second affirmative for that speech, and I welcome second negative to continue the debate.
What's important about learning these global languages is that it opens up a lot of new opportunities. Because when you say that you can speak a language that is very widely spoken by a large majority of the population, you just look like a more impressive hire, a more impressive person to admit to your school. And I think the affirmative team is incredibly uncharitable here by saying that you don't learn this language to the extent to which you are conversational. Because I think that there are a lot of reasons, there are a lot of unique incentives with these global languages to continue to learn, to continue to become proficient, and that means that a lot of the material that Ollie gives you at first does still stand, the benefits still exist. Two things in my speech. First thing, why people don't actually learn, why indigenous languages are often not taught well and very poorly internalized by these children. Secondly, why these global languages will be taught well, that children understand it, children end up understanding it, and why teaching it in school is a unique way for them to open up all of these pathways like I mentioned to you. At the top of my speech, first I want to kind of clarify what this comparative looks like. Because note that on their side, to an extent there is a trade-off between learning the language and like learning to respect the indigenous culture. Because note that often in schools, indigenous language is just not taught super often. In New Zealand, Māori is taught for 1 hour a week, which means that you are incredibly time poor. You have to allocate that time in an efficient way, which means that either people don't learn language or culture particularly well, or you have to only teach language and the culture becomes the culture is far more likely to be neglected. Note that on the comparative, it is far more likely for this language to be taught relatively often because Western schools see learning a global language as more utile. They see it as a more efficient use of time to teach these kids how to learn a global language and to open up all of these potential opportunities for them in the future. This means that you're likely to see things like 1 hour a day. It means that you're more likely to see more immersion opportunities. That means that a lot of the stuff that they give you is relatively uncharitable in terms of how much children are actually learning these global languages versus these indigenous ones. First thing then on why we think that the indigenous languages aren't going to be taught well and aren't going to be properly internalized. First thing on why they're not going to be taught well. Three reasons here. First thing, they conceded to at first that these languages are often not taught to be spoken, which means that it makes it really difficult to engage in things like deep cultural discourse when you're unable to learn the language in which you can have the most nuanced and most critical conversations with native speakers. Secondly, I think the curriculum is just really weak because it is a massive leap in logic to say that you can get all of the resources, you can get all of the useful resources to teach a school kid a new language from elders and from native speakers of this language. But secondly, governments are just really, really bad at writing like indigenous language curriculums because often the people that are writing these curriculums, people in like the Department of Education, just aren't particularly educated on these indigenous cultures, on these indigenous languages. But finally, and most importantly, note that the teachers that care the most about these languages, native speakers, are unlikely going to be the ones that are teaching these languages in schools. Because firstly, there's a massive disillusionment with a lot of Western systems. Oftentimes in these post-colonial states where these languages are dying, it's really hard to trust Western governments. It's hard to trust schools that are led by white people to think that they have the best interest in teaching your language. But secondly, there's a lot of restrictions because when you have to teach to a particular curriculum, you feel like it's far harder for you to teach in a way that you feel is the most fulfilling, the most productive, in order to get people to learn this language and to learn it well. Which means that these teachers, these people who are good at this language, the people that truly care, are unlikely to opt into teaching at schools. It's more likely that they're going to be teaching in places where they have more autonomy, teaching outside of school, teaching in local community centers. Those are the instances in which you get the most positive, productive form of teaching. But then that means that a lot of the material that they give you on people understanding the language, of potentially revitalizing the language, just all completely fall out of the debate that locks them out of most of the benefits that they give you. But secondly, on why people just don't internalize this well, even if it is often taught in these schools. Two main reasons why it's just because they broadly assert to you that that people are going to internalize this well, people are going to really care about this culture now because they taught it in schools. Two reasons why I don't think it's very true. First thing, students are really bad at internalizing these learnings a lot, especially when once a week you are put into a classroom and taught a language that you didn't necessarily opt into. This leads to things like potentially making jokes about the indigenous language. Like in New Zealand, how people make jokes about the Māori language very often after Māori classes, trying to get the Māori teacher to get distracted during class in order to not have to learn the language. And secondly, it's a lack of cultural understanding. Because if you don't enjoy learning the language and you feel like you're forced into it, it's really hard to, it's a big leap in logic to say that you're going to internalize this culture well, respect this culture, and view it in a positive light. But secondly, beyond just the students, I think there's a lot less just broad respect for indigenous cultures. Because clearly here, it seems like there's an opportunity cost, which is learning global languages. A lot of often a lot of quite conservative parents, a lot of quite conservative politicians do have a lot of backlash towards this indigenous language curriculum. For example, again, sorry about the New Zealand spec, guys, like right-wing politicians just often say that indigenous language is taking over our schools, which means that there's a lot more polarization and a lot more separatism around whether or not indigenous language is valuable to learn, and by extension, whether that culture is valuable to keep alive and to continue to learn. I think it means that students just internalize this less. So what does this mean then? This means that in this, these indigenous language are unlikely to be revived. People are unlikely to learn these cultures well. On the comparative, when you have more people likely buying into these external classes because now you feel like you're not learning anything about these indigenous cultures through school, that's when people treat the cultures with respect. That's when people actually try to learn the language. That's when the language is actually comparatively more likely to get revived on our side. Finally then, let's talk about these global languages. Because the first thing that they tell you is that there are other ways to learn global languages. And again, I think this is a really uncharitable claim. Firstly, guidance is incredibly important when you're learning languages. It's really vital to have someone to explain to you, hey, you did this specific grammar point wrong, maybe you need to work on this, maybe you didn't know how to conjugate that verb particularly well, and they give you the guidance to point you in the right direction to become better at the language. Secondly, note that it's just really hard to learn a language via a textbook, because often these global languages are incredibly difficult to understand, incredibly difficult to just read about and know, which means that these textbooks can only teach students to a certain extent, and then it leads to things like plateaus because they don't receive enough particular guidance. And finally, on classes, they're just really expensive, right? Chinese classes can be $60 an hour, and the average person often doesn't necessarily want to put $60 an hour every week into learning these languages. Well, extension of that impact then is an increase in wealth disparities, because we explained to you how important it is to learn these global languages, because in an increasingly competitive job and university scene, you need to learn multiple languages in order to stand out. You need to learn these multiple languages in order to gain these opportunities, and it is going to be the people that can afford to go to these classes that gain these opportunities, making it far harder for people from disadvantaged backgrounds to even break into a lot of these jobs and opportunities. But the final thing that they say is that you don't learn global languages well. Firstly, note at the top of this that, as they explained to you, kids do not know what languages to choose, and on our side, they actually are sort of prioritized into learning these global languages, which means that they're likely to opt into a relatively utile language. The two responses as to why they're likely to learn this language well then. Firstly, note that the intuition pump is just intuition pump at 2A is just a little bit silly. Often at the end of high school, a lot of people are semi-fluent, which is why a lot of people who finish HSC French, for example, go into level 2000 or 3000 courses. But secondly, there's an incentive to keep learning. They're incredibly uncomparative, because on our side, there's a larger incentive to continue learning the language because there is a specific utility behind it, and you're going to gain specific opportunities out of it, which means that on their side, there's actually less of an incentive to continue learning the language, because it's hard to see where the benefit takes place. It's hard to see where you're going to get any specific particular gains out of it, which means on our side, we just open doors for kids, and we don't lead to disrespect of indigenous cultures, so you should stand with negative.
Wonderful. I thank second negative for that speech, and I welcome third affirmative to continue the debate.
Two things in the speech, firstly on Indigenous people and languages, and secondly on education. Firstly on Indigenous languages. The first thing I want to do at this issue is just cut out the stuff that they say about sanitisation of languages and disrespect of languages and stuff like that, because it's just the least important aspect of this debate. Languages that have large currency and are generally spoken by large amounts of popularity, the example they give you are rebel groups fighting against governments, probably mean that those languages are relatively strong. So insofar as governments don't do a good job of teaching them in schools, it's okay, because these languages are already spoken at home anyway. Also, probably better for these governments that have been in conflict with these groups anyway to make some attempt at reconciliation through teaching an indigenous language at school and not just teaching through a majority language, which is the alternative that they support is just erasure. So even if they do things imperfectly, it's still preferable to what happens under their side of the house. It just means that you get some engagement, but also because people already speak this language at home as they characterize in these contexts, they can correct the teachers in the class if they use the wrong vocabulary, so that means that everyone learns anyway. I think the problem with the negative team in this debate is that they're just too black and white with their conceptions of how languages work, right? Languages are not either dead or alive. The vulnerability of languages exists on a relative spectrum. We giving you 3 distinct different categories in this debate. Firstly, languages that are dying in the status quo and need some form of revitalization effort, which they do not give any alternative path to accessing under their side of the house, because they don't have any way to explain why the government would invest that alternatively. But the second context we give you is that languages that are undergoing revitalization right now. So examples of Irish, which has hit rock bottom at some point and is now increasing the amount of speakers, becomes increasingly useful for people to learn now, but there are still some people who are monolingual Irish speakers, I guess, who are relatively old and who learnt that language, their native language, before, I guess, English took prominence. But then thirdly, we talk about languages that have a large amount of monolingual speakers right now, but not the predominant language in a particular area as well. So I think we explain why we benefit all 3 of those people. Their obvious push, I think, an attempt to try and co-opt our benefits is by saying they would do things as an elective, but then give no reason why schools would prioritise or put resources into that elective, or why the government will do that. So you have to believe that it's exclusive under our side of the house we are able to get benefits to people learning these languages. They have a couple of pushbacks as to why we can't get benefits. The first thing they say is the government would be bad at doing this, right? Because they would not put a lot of money or effort into the research. But I think the government is bad at doing things when it thinks that it knows what it's doing. But obviously in the circumstances of dead languages that have to be revitalized, the government has no idea any meaningful ways in which these languages work, which is why they like to outsource this work to linguists who I guess are relatively cheap because they don't have good job security. Obviously there is some degree of language documentation that exists right now, but what we uniquely explain to is not particularly accessible, right? It exists in linguistic corpuses, the corpora, and linguistic grammars that are accessible to linguists, but have not been reframed to be useful for general people to learn. So what we explain to you is their unique benefit, right? Whatever happens after this revitalization process, it means that people in indigenous communities right now can use the resources that were created for schools to teach their kids the languages that they otherwise wouldn't be able to learn, because obviously English has so much more currency. They can teach it to their kids as a second language, but obviously there are large benefits teaching them at school as well. The second push at second is to say, well, you won't get good teachers, but we explain a couple of good responses to this. Firstly, under their side of the house, it's just unclear what the alternative to accessing cultural knowledge is, right? Because maybe they can prompt you, although it's unexplicit, they have people who teach you about indigenous culture at some point in time, but of course it's far less likely to be as intensive as language learning is. The amount of access you have to cultural teachers just doesn't exist in the same way. But secondly, language learning curricula are not particularly prescriptive. They have outcomes and that you need to be able to demonstrate certain abilities, but they're not prescriptive to the way you teach languages, because obviously different kids learn differently anyway, so it'd be silly to prescribe teachers to use a particular course. But thirdly, we would just say that teachers, indigenous people often care about the revitalization of their language, so obviously they want to spread this language, and the easiest way that you can do this in a government-supported program at schools, because you get the most money and funding and kids in there as well. But fourthly, we also explained to you at first speaker that even if these aren't native speakers of the languages, non-native speakers of the language who put the time and effort into learning that language often particularly care about the culture and care about the revitalization of the language, so we're likely to spread it here. So what this means is you get really good teachers for these kids. I think this is particularly important when we engage with the things that they say in second about lack of respect, because the first thing to note is you're learning these languages from a young age, so respect is inculcated to you from when you are 5 or 6 years old, which does not happen under their side of the house, because you do not have that consistent engagement with the language that exists there. But also secondly, to note that racism exists in the status quo, right? Indigenous people have to deal with this regardless, and that is probably in most cases because there is no inconsistent engagement with these cultures through kids when they come up from a young age. What we explain to you is having someone that you respect, a teacher who is venerated in your classroom, who is described by other people as a source of knowledge, that you can talk to, that you can ask questions of, that you can learn about their culture from, means that people likely to become better over time. Yes, it is probably true that there is some backlash immediately, but that backlash happens whether or not you're teaching these languages at the school, right? Like, people don't care about indigenous cultures regardless of whether or not their kids are forced to learn that language. So it's not likely to be a meaningful change. But what we do get are kids who are better able to deal with these problems in the future and are better able to engage and have access to culture, because obviously they can't do anything meaningful to stop this either. They just have to stop it continuing to exist, and it continues to exist while people's ability to speak these languages and access their own culture reduces in the future, because the revitalization efforts are unlikely to occur under their side of the house. But then finally, just dealing with the second context of the debate, which the second and third context, which they don't engage with, we explain to you why you get huge benefits for monolingual speakers of these languages right now when their language is taught in schools in the first place. So when you have people learning Creole in the Northern Territory, it's very useful because there are a lot of monolingual Creole speakers right now. And then if people are conversational in Creole, as they are likely to be by, I guess, Neg's own characterization, that means that those people are less likely to be disenfranchised and unable to access service that exists right now. Those people do exist in the status quo. They're often relatively old because they learned this language when it was native. They didn't end up learning English as a transition, like younger people don't speak it. That's really important. It also happens intergenerationally in families. When kids can't communicate with their own grandparents because the languages that are spoken are different, obviously awesome under our side of the house if we allow people to engage in that way as well. So we explained to you the benefit for revitalization in the first place that cannot happen there, so of course you lose all of the culture and the knowledge that comes with that as well, that is inherent in this language, but you also allow people to feel cultural loss. But also we explained that there are other benefits to indigenous groups that are not necessarily particularly as marginalized as these groups in Australia, but also are of course benefited by by people understanding their language in general, that makes them feel happier and allows them to access self-actualization. Secondly, on education, first thing I'll note is we have equal fiat in this debate, right? So to the extent they want to say they do these classes an hour a day, we're also able to do these classes an hour a day, and therefore you'd get to the same level. But notably, I think they set the bar really high for themselves in this debate, right? They say this is about people being able to get into university, study overseas, have professional jobs, and then they tell you what people are after high school is conversational. Conversational is not enough for you to get a good score in the IELT to be able to study overseas, and the obvious intuition for this is most countries teach English, but IELT classes are still a huge source of revenue and very lucrative because people don't get to the stage where they need to be to actually pass these tests. That's why so many people who end up overseas are still likely to be rich, even if you learn these classes in high school anyway. So conversational is not good enough to get them the benefits that they want in this debate. But they also just don't prove that they get there particularly clearly, because just an assertion that this is sufficient to get you to the level they taught you. We explain it's often not a non-native speaker in the first place, but often the classroom is particularly unnatural language, right? It is important that you learn through things like media alternatively, because that is how people actually speak in these contexts. A lot of the time textbooks are particularly old-fashioned or not particularly there. But thirdly, we explain that it's likely to be inconsistent. Like second language learning in New South Wales is only compulsory to year 8, and even then it's only 100 hours in that year, right? So their side defends people dropping out of language learning when they are the youngest and the least likely to understand the benefits of it. So most people don't even get to the point where they would be able to end up professional under their side of the house. The intuition here, the kid that you know that comes back from French exchange is always way ahead of everyone else because they've actually been engaged with the language and immersed. That is how immigrants learn languages when they move. It's just not true they're able to get there in classroom. We explain to you alternatives exist in this debate are preferable. They say, well, you need discipline so these alternatives don't work. But the discipline comes from parents, right? If parents think it is so useful for the kids to learn languages, they'll encourage them to do it regardless. They're able to do so with the litany of resources that exist. Like different textbooks explain it in different ways if kids have trouble in the first place. But also when you're older and you have greater capacity, you can use these resources, but obviously you can't the alternative. But we explain to you as well, it's just more engaging. If you're someone who doesn't perceive themselves as ever going to overseas, learning a global language is not particularly helpful. And that's the reality for the vast majority of people who can't afford to study overseas at university, for example. But what you can see is the person in your town that you might be able to speak to who speaks an indigenous language. You see how you might be able to practice with them where you never understand how this otherwise could be relevant. So it is engaging and kids do care. So proud to propose.
Wonderful. I take third affirmative for that speech, and I welcome third negative to conclude the debate.
The first question I'm going to ask in this speech is how will kids engage with indigenous languages? And the intuition I want to start off is kind of Ali concedes in her speech about other languages that most kids just forget the vast majority of things they learn at school. So this team to gain any of the benefits about indigenous immersion, communication with other indigenous people, but also wider political benefits about the indigenous population. They have to explain why kids will actually internalize these benefits and internalize a language over a long period of time and actually care about it to engage in the classes in many instances. And the first thing I want to observe in this debate is that the benefits, some of the benefits this team initially claims are already symmetric. Like we already have indigenous, things on signs of indigenous languages. We already teach indigenous history and culture in history and geography classes all the time throughout all curriculums in many instances. A lot of benefits just learning about indigenous tribes, or about these cultures or about their politics is actually not exclusive to languages. It happens already. This is important because I would explain, secondly, that I just dispute that languages are a specifically useful or important specific way to actually learn about these cultures. Because when you learn a language, it's not only about things like vocabulary, memorizing things in lists, and for very, I would say, tests that, about facts. We've learned that about culture and history or about geography. It's more accessible. It's in your own language, for example. You can engage with it much more. But also actually about the events that affect these people as a whole. And Felix is you learn about dreamtime stories. That's a very high bar. When you're learning language as a young kid, you're not learning about, the deep cultures of these things. You learn about, vocab lists, basic vocabulary, greetings, saying hello, how are you? This is not actual cultural immersion. Doing classes on history, on the frontier wars, on massacres, aren't actually displaced there. That is real cultural education, not this very strange young age language learning this team is very unspecific about. But thirdly, in cases like Ireland, where there's like a massive revitalization of the language, where like, everyone wants to speak it, it's so unclear why you need to prioritize it in formal schooling. Like all the reasons they give why you have resources made for global languages, that obviously also applies when there's a massive revitalization of a country or a culture in Ireland to speak these languages. That is obviously not exclusive. The next thing they say is that, it's very engaging to learn indigenous language. But I think this is just so untrue. Firstly, there's just a massive political baked-in immersion. These are dead languages. Like the average Australian kid thinks this language is a dead language. It's useless. It hangs over them in all these initial classes. And importantly, if a kid ignores this language in like the first class or the first years, it's very hard to get that back on track after that. But second of all, though, there is obviously a large and massive cultural gap this team refuses to engage with. The average white Australian is so distant at this point from indigenous culture, from tribes, from their lifestyle. It's so unclear why they'd find that interesting or engaging. But thirdly, I do not think this team can get it taught by indigenous elders. Sadly, there are just not many elders left who speak these languages fluently in these cultures. You cannot staff every school classroom in Australia with indigenous elders, with indigenous people, even if they want to do that. This is likely to be taught by white teachers from textbooks made by linguists, which makes it less engaging, less immersive, and not get the respect benefits that this team wants to talk about. But also, finally, I just do think that this team is awfully unspecific about how these benefits trickle down to indigenous people. They say things like, you want to, know language in the community, you'll know a couple of words, you'll respect them. But does that actually change interaction in the community? Like if I can say hello, how are you, or how are you doing to an indigenous person in my community, do I actually care about them more? Do I actually care about their politics more? Does it change the incentive structures of racism and discrimination? I don't think it does. I just don't think that's actually a clear benefit in the debate. Same reason that, if you learn conversational French, you're gonna love French people much more. It's unclear why you love indigenous people as well by just being conversational. But finally, I also just do think that in monolithic language cases that they talk about, that incentive is already there. Like if there's a massive Creole population in the NT and you talk to them all the time, you don't require the federal government to step in. Local schools and governments will teach these languages anyway. They will have people in those schools teach that language and it's already be commonly used. There's unclear why in those monolithic languages, those contexts where you need to help people from those languages speak, if there's a delta. Like if there are a large number of Creole speakers in your class, you are required to help them, find people to teach them and support them. That is not a large delta in this debate. That explains why. The final claim at 3A is the government will default to linguists and stuff like that. But this misses our claim. I do not deny that you're going to have very nice indigenous textbooks, very nice materials. The question is, how in the classroom does this get delivered and internalized? You have the nicest textbook you want by a very nice linguist. If a teacher is unenthused, if students are turning off, if students don't understand the benefits of this language, there's a reputation for versus dead language, it will never actually be internalized even if the resources are very good. That claim falls out. That explains why, at their best case, a couple of people can speak indigenous languages conversationally, they know some words, they know some phrases, that does not get the benefits this team claims on research, on understanding, on politics, or on culture. I think why this debate actually takes place, which is the importance of global languages. And the weighing here is incredibly simple. A global second language for a lot of people is the ticket to uplift. It's ticket to a better high school or better university that you travel. Ticket to a better domestic or international job that makes more money. It is the largest, most tangible benefit to individuals in this debate, and that's important. And I think this team misunderstands the amount that kids understand this benefit. Yes, obviously, a 5-year-old does not know about the Chinese government, but I think that increasingly these days, kids very young care about their future education. For example, I hear year 7s all the time talk about ATARs and the HSC. Kids are pretty switched on. I think they care. They hear from their parents education is important. They care about it themselves. They see grades. They value it. That is something that's very important. They do care about these kinds of things. And the main claim we get from this team was twofold. The first one is that, you just learn them in languages. But we explained very little specific response that structure in formal schooling is very important for a series of reasons. First of all, you need to learn language in very specific ways, for exams as we explained, but also you just need to be disciplined with kids over a large process of years, right? I guess on their side they'll watch an English movie, they might, engage with an online course at home and click on some multiple choice questions, but having it as part of the formal school curriculum is a massive difference, right? It's monthly exams and tests, it's daily classes in a lot of countries to speak English. This is a massive difference. It's not just, a kind of formality, but also, it's also important to internalize this is very important for kids. Like if you put it in the formal schooling system, it's seen as important and valuable by students. They care about it more, they value it much more as well. And that's important, because oftentimes parents in these countries, I don't believe that kids can access English coaching or can afford it. You need to have an early internalization as well. The next claim then also is that, oh, you just don't get fluent anyway, you kind of like just are conversational. But first of all, I think 5 years of high school language is quite a lot. It's 5 years of weekly classes. It's not just learning conversation, that's just not true. But second of all, even if it is not just conversational, it is an important starting out point. Because it's just true that if you do not do like HSC French, you are so unlikely to do it at university now. You even want to, or think you can, or you can try it. Having them learn language early and realize it is enjoyable and fun and they're good at it, that creates the massive preface and delta to learn it later in university and engage it later in your life. And yes, this team is right. You do need to immerse yourself, but if you learn HSC French, that's when you go on your immersion afterwards because you have those skills already. You have those skills conversationally. That's when you do choose to take a trip to France. On their side, there's no trip to be taken, no immersion to be done afterwards, which is why that is unique on our side to learn those kind of languages. But also, finally, I do just think that what am I going to say here? Oh, it doesn't matter. Okay, and then that explains then why people, yes, they don't learn the fluency language perfectly, but it sets up the structure, the practice, the skills, and the intuition to go further in life. And these benefits are the most certain in this debate. It's higher paying jobs, better universities and schools. This is crucial and important. And lastly, that's why you do it anyway, but we explain an accessibility problem. A lot of people, lower middle incomes, cannot afford English tutoring, cannot afford these nice textbooks, cannot afford to, understand where to go or how to learn. Formal education is the key for those things, and that outweighs all the very speculative benefits on learning some indigenous words or some kind of political change. For those reasons, vote side negative.
Wonderful. I thank the negative for that speech. I thank all 6 speakers for a great debate as well. We're going to now go and deliberate, and then we'll come back for the closing round.